Lesson 41, Slavery in the Transatlantic Economy. So in the 16th century, slave traders were primarily Iberian, which means they were either Spanish or Portuguese, because the Iberian Peninsula is made up of Spain and Portugal. In the 17th century, the slave traders tended to be from the Netherlands. They tended to be Dutch. In the late 17th century and 18th century, they were primarily English. So colonial trade during this time period, it's triangular trade or Atlantic-based trade. You have European goods, especially guns, going to Africa. So that's one leg of the triangle. There are three, right? So one leg is from Europe to Africa. It's mainly guns. African slaves go across to the New World. That's the also known as the Middle Passage. And the New World, you have sugar and other things, and they're going to Europe. And that's the triangular trade. It's really famous. It's used in a lot of things. Test questions on triangular trade happen a lot in AP tests and also in the Regents exams that New York State gives, for example. And there's also the trade between New England and the West Indies, which had a lot to do with a war we're going to talk about later called the War of Jenkins' Ear, which has one of the coolest names for a war ever, and we'll learn about that later. And that would be New England fish, rum, and lumber going to the West Indies, and they're getting sugar from the West Indies. The word sugar just pops up over and over again. Okay, so this one, cities that profited from slave trade at one time or another, there's a list of them in your textbook. Liverpool in England, Amsterdam also in Europe, but this is in the Netherlands, the city of Nantes in France, and Newport in Rhode Island. I bet you've heard of that place. British North American colonies made more by supplying goods to West Indian markets than directly from the slave trade. So that made kind of, a lot of people, I think, probably think the slave trade, just literally selling slaves, was the most profitable thing you could do, and it was just part of the economy. Cotton, tobacco, and sugar all depended on slave labor. 18th century African civil wars increased the slave supply. An example the book uses is the succession wars in the Congo. A succession war means a war between two people who think they should succeed whoever was the king before. And they're usually related. So some African kings deliberately fought wars to procure or get slaves to trade for guns. And this created a cycle of conflict in Africa, where these African rulers who built empires from warfare to get slaves just continued the process over and over again, which created a lot of violence. And of course, they're focusing on male slaves. So you have African slave populations in North and South America that are more male-centered, and then you have a more female-centered population left in places like West Africa. The experience of slavery. Slave traders transported something like 9 to 12 million Africans across the Atlantic. Some estimates claim that maybe 2 to 3 million Africans died on the way over in cramped conditions. It is the largest intercontinental migration in history. The first 4 centuries of settlement in the New World, there were far more Africans coming in than Europeans. Of course, the death rate for Africans was much higher than Europeans settling in North and South America. Conditions during the Middle Passage, that passage across the Atlantic from Africa to the New World, was horrible. It was deadly. They just packed people in, had them lay down in decks with just a couple of feet of space above them. So you can imagine breathing everybody else's already breathed air, and it's not like you're getting to go anywhere to go to the bathroom or anything. It was really gross. I think you guys are getting the picture. And more African men than women were transported. I kind of already mentioned that. The population was divided between new slaves, old slaves, and Creoles. Slave owners preferred old slaves and Creoles. Creoles in this case is probably what you usually think of for Creoles, right? As opposed to what we discussed before with Latin America. New slaves were subjected to seasoning. They were given new names, new work skills sometimes, and they learned a European language at least well enough to get along and communicate. Sometimes there was a sort of apprenticeship for new slaves to older slaves, and North American slave owners preferred to have slaves who are already seasoned in the Caribbean. So a lot of slaves who came to North America, came to the States, originally spent some time in the Caribbean. Language and culture. Most slaves were living on rural plantations, but these rural plantations were not completely isolated. African languages were often spoken. Coromantee was spoken in Jamaica. Kikongo was spoken in South Carolina and Santo Domingo. And Santo Domingo, remember, that's the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And it took 2 generations often for slaves to a slave colony, essentially, for a European language to dominate. Of course, it was discouraged. European slave owners liked to have slaves who didn't come from the same area and speak the same language, because when they spoke the same language, they could cooperate with each other. The slaves could organize based on similar African languages. It was the basis for preserving old religions. They organized lay religious brotherhoods for charity, elected kings and queens from various plantations. So the slaves were trying to reorganize as best they could under the conditions they were in to kind of emulate what their experiences had been in Africa. And these African languages helped them communicate to organize revolts. There was one in South Carolina in 1739, and there was one in Jamaica in the early 1760s. And then the Haitian Revolution, the first successful slave revolution in the 1790s, led by Toussaint Louverture. Daily life. Portuguese slaves had the fewest legal protections. The Spanish church tried to protect African slaves in Spanish America, but they focused more on Native Americans than they did on African slaves. Slave codes in British and French America were very limited as far as protecting slaves. The laws and regulations were designed more to prevent slave revolt than to take care of slaves. And masters were allowed to whip and beat slaves. Slaves were often forbidden the right to assemble in large groups. And slave marriages were unrecognized. So they would easily, slave owners could easily sell members of a slave family, a married couple with their kids. They could just rip that family apart and sell somebody, and did so. And children of slaves were slaves. Most slaves faced a daily life of hard farm work, poor diet, and poor housing. Slave families could be separated. We just kind of pointed that out. And slaves in all plantation societies faced great hardship. Your book is focusing on the idea that they all had it rough, and that's true. I still, from what I've read, it sounds like sugar plantations were the worst place to be. Conversion to Christianity. Most African slaves, like Native Americans, converted to Christianity. Protestant and Catholic Christianity preached acceptance of slavery and a natural social hierarchy, so it kind of helped establish kind of the authority of slave owners. Some African religious practices survived, often mixed with Christianity. If you know anything about Santeria or voodoo, some of that stuff gets mixed in there. And if you don't, well, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail on it because that's not something that AP Europe focuses in on. European racial attitudes. Europeans were prejudiced against black Africans, seeing them as uncivilized and as basically slaves, fit for slavery. European culture often used the color black in a negative light. Before slavery, African slavery became a popular thing in Europe. Racial thinking about slavery became more important in the 19th century in slave owners' thinking, and European and African slave societies were unique in world history. This kind of system existed from the 16th to the late 19th century. It ended in stages: the Haitian Revolution in 1794, the British outlawed slave trade in 1807, the Emancipation Proclamation of the United States in 1863, Brazilian emancipation of slaves in 1888. However, the legacy of slavery is still an issue today.